Absolutely extraordinary report from Lord Dyson. He's a former Master of the Rolls, and it's a 127-page report into one of the biggest interviews ever broadcast on British television, the Martin Bashir Panorama interview on the BBC way back in 1995 with Diana, Princess of Wales. She was still, of course, the wife of the future king at that point, although separated from him. But that interview inevitably led to the divorce and, well, everything that happened since. Earl Spencer and others, her brother, suggesting that actually this was a part of the ripple effect that led inevitably to her death in Paris in 1997. Let's have a listen right now, though, to a full statement given at 10 o'clock last night by Prince William, of course, future king himself, about that Lord Dyson report and all of the damning comments about the BBC. Let's have a listen to what Prince William had to say.
I would like to thank Lord Dyson and his team for the report. It is welcome that the BBC accepts Lord Dyson's findings in full, which are extremely concerning. That BBC employees lied and used fake documents to obtain the interview with my mother, made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia, displayed woeful incompetence when investigating complaints and concerns about the programme, and were evasive in their reporting to the media and covered up what they knew from their internal investigation. It is my view that the deceitful way the interview was obtained substantially influenced what my mother said. The interview was a major contribution to making my parents' relationship worse and has since hurt countless others. It brings indescribable sadness to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns first raised in 1995, my mother would have known that she had been deceived. She was failed not just by a rogue reporter, but by leaders at the BBC who looked the other way rather than asking the tough questions. It is my firm view that this Panorama programme holds no legitimacy and should never be aired again. It effectively established a false narrative which for over a quarter of a century has been commercialised by the BBC and others. This settled narrative now needs to be addressed by the BBC and anyone else who has written or intends to write about these events. In an era of fake news, public service broadcasting and a free press have never been more important. These failings, identified by investigative journalists, not only let my mother down and my family down, they let the public down too.
That was the statement that was issued by Prince William last night. An absolutely extraordinary statement, I think we can agree. Let's talk to Rupert Bell, talkRADIO's royal correspondent, who joins us now. Good morning to you, Rupert.
Good morning, Julie.
A devastating report from Lord Dyson. I would say even more devastating comments there from Prince William.
I think those are, it's almost unheralded. The way he just went out and said it from the heart, it's very unroyal-like in a way, from just basically saying it as a son about his mother. And okay, the circumstances around the royal family, but really putting the knife into the BBC in not holding back, which is, as I say, very unroyal-like and unusual. Normally, you might just see a statement will be coming out from a future king reacting to the inquiry, but instead it was no holds barred, and he is quite clear in his condemnation of the BBC and the way they carried out their own internal inquiry back in '96. And I think more importantly, he's saying that interview now needs to be put to bed and never seen again. And I think it really, they are right in many ways. It did add to the breakdown and further break down the relationship between William's mother and father. And I think it did lead to the feeding frenzy around Diana for the next couple of years before she tragically died in that car crash at the age of 36. Remember, that's the same age as Harry is now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. The ripple effect of this is something both boys talked about. I say boys, but young men. Harry, of course, gave a statement as well, although not to camera. And it doesn't have quite the same overtones and undertones as Williams does. But in terms of what William had to say about the effect that it's had on Diana, and of course there's an impact, of course, in terms of our trust in the BBC and the role of the BBC, but talking about the royal family, first of all, we need to put this in context, don't we? The couple, Diana and Charles, were already at this point separated. It had become an intolerable marriage. We know that Prince Charles was already, as she said, and Prince Charles said in later interviews, was already admitted to having had this long-term affair with Camilla Parker Bowles, hence her statement, this marriage was crowded. There were 3 of us in this marriage. And of course, one of the most famous clips from that. She was open that she herself had affairs subsequently as well. She was already very paranoid and untrusting of those around her, but we know for good reason. We know as journalists that people were briefing against her from the palace. So although this was exploited by Martin Bashir, it wasn't created by Martin Bashir, was it? It wasn't sort of, hey, by the way, you think everyone's fine and your marriage is fine, but actually everyone's briefing against you, and this is what's happening. This was already real. He just lied about different aspects of it, and he exploited her fears about it.
Yeah, there was a feeding frenzy around Diana when the marriage broke down, and Prince Charles did an interview with Jonathan Dimbleby where he admitted he had an affair with Camilla. So it added to the whole sort of as I say, it just was a constant desire to find out more and more about Diana. Everybody, that era of sort of, free for all as far as the paparazzi was concerned, and she was at the heart of it. She wasn't entirely clueless in how to deal with the PR, so let's not pretend that she didn't have a complete understanding that she could play the game and make sure that she was the one who had the moral high ground. And that interview, certainly at the end of it, 23 million people watched the interview with Martin Bashir. She definitely had the moral high ground. The Queen then instructed them to get divorced just before the Christmas of that year. So the whole thing added to the sense of, well, probably her own paranoia, and added to it because more and more she felt the victim. She clearly had issues throughout the marriage, talking about her bulimia and other issues that she faced.
Well, I'd have issues if my husband was still having sex with another woman. I mean, call me old-fashioned.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think we all do, and call me old-fashioned too. And this was the problem. And as a young girl, remember how much younger she was than Prince Charles, and going through her 20s. And you think by the time she was killed, just 36 years of age, that is one heck of a life. Constantly from a sort of with a lady who had her own troubles in her childhood, very unhappy childhood at times, and again had to deal with all the issues of suddenly being, found this bride for Prince Charles. That was almost.
But the thing is, this stretches back many, many decades. I mean, it's 26 years since that report went out. Of course, the key thing that came out in this Lord Dyson report, and it's 127 pages, and it is absolutely damning about Martin Bashir and his deceit and what he did. But it makes it clear, and as William stresses, it wasn't just one rogue reporter, because a year later, the newspapers were publishing reports saying, look, their subterfuge had been used, deceit had been used to get this interview. Of course, there was a lot of bad feeling. Everyone had wanted this interview. But nevertheless, those claims were true. An investigation was carried out. The then Chairman, Lord Hall, and as they basically said, look, they as has been uncovered now, they discovered that, yes, deceit had been used as a way of getting that interview. And then they covered it up. And they covered it up again and again and again. And even, we were just talking to Tom Bauer about it, who used to be a Panorama investigative journalist himself, that even as late as last October, when we saw reports about this story coming up again as a result of Freedom of Information requests that finally produced the goods, that they were still covering it up then. This shows decades and decades of the BBC top brass making conscious decisions to cover up serious wrongdoing by their own journalists and covering up previous cover-ups. Now, Earl Spencer, the brother of Diana, he has been instrumental in bringing this out in the last year, but also he's called for Scotland Yard to launch criminal investigations into this. Now, we're not just talking about the BBC being held to higher standards than others because they're a national broadcaster. We are talking about serious wrongdoing here. Lots of people are liking this too. The phone hacking scandal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the BBC, they got themselves into a complete pickle, basically. They wanted to always be seen to be the moral arbiters of absolutely everything.
Don't
and
they
that
just?
was the point. And they thought, with this interview, look how brilliant we are. They couldn't be seen that they are basically working in the same means as many other people are, underhand ways to get something. Now, the Panorama program over the years has been supposed to be a beacon of investigative journalism. And that also was one of the problems because of the standards that that program was supposed to have. It was something that it was a must-watch viewing at times and always had high, hard-hitting reports. And so if this was seen to be a sort of cheap, sleazy program in the end, which is now, it transpires, it was in the attempts the way Martin Bashir went, or even though he is standing by the contents of the interview and saying what was said then was what she and Diana was happy with the interview. Let's remember she wrote a letter saying she was happy with the contents, but what it did do, it just opened the floodgates even more and the spotlight on a woman who was probably fragile mentally anyway.
Indeed.
And it added, compounded to her problems, and the press.
And the ripple effects, not just reaching into her death a couple of years later, but also into, of course, what's happened with Prince Harry and his breakaway from the royal family in the last year or two. Prince Harry issued a statement last night. He said, basically thanking those who've taken accountability. He says, that is the first step towards justice and truth. Yet what deeply concerns me is that practices like these, and even worse, are still widespread today. Then and now, it's bigger than one outlet, one network or one publication. Our mother lost her life because of this, and nothing has changed. He's also on camera today. Clips have been released of his latest interview with Oprah Winfrey for the Apple TV series The Me You Can't See, and has talked about how he turned to drink and drugs to mask the pain after his mother's death. The repercussions of this years later are huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can feel, how young were William and Harry at the time. And then the spotlight of that funeral and everything. They were in a giant, great big goldfish bowl. And Harry obviously didn't have neither of them had the wherewithal. But did the royal family also have the mental capacity to deal with it? And that appears to be part of the problem. And what Harry is alluding to is that no one knew how to deal with it. And we saw, the reaction of the country at the time, the Queen film, where stuck up in Balmoral, did they tap into the public zeitgeist and understand what was going on? And I think that is part of what Harry, give him some support of what is actually his saying is that they didn't really feel that. It was almost like there was a cold barrier down and they had no idea how to deal with it in a human context, which is what this was about, and the modern way of relationships.
Rupert, we'll have to leave it there. We're obviously going to be talking more about the repercussions of the BBC as repercussions for the royal family and for all of us in terms of trust in the organisation of the BBC, who set themselves up to such a high